All right, so when we look at Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, it has a couple key components that need to be recognized. But before we get into those two components, let's be clear that the evolution debate in science is exactly how does evolution happen and what controls it. It's not really, there is no debate that evolution as a phenomenon exists. Remember, it's the theory of evolution, the explanation of what we see that is being refined, that we're trying to understand. It's not the concept, and it's not the reality that evolution exists, because evolution we know exists, we observe it, it's observed, it's fact. It's the theory of explaining how evolution occurs and what the factors are that influence it that go back and forth with debate. Although, for the most part, a lot of it's understood. There's still a lot of details and concepts that, as we reveal more about the world, as we understand how things work more, as we collect more evidence, we refine our understanding. We refine the theory, the explanation of evolution, so we refine the theory of evolution. For instance, previously we talked about Lamarck and his ideas of evolution. For the longest time, it was put aside as not reasonable, as the evidence that we see did not support his concept of how evolution works. But today we know that part of his explanation, the idea that the environment influences the trait, we know actually does occur, and that you can inherit that environmental impact on the genome. Again, we call that epigenetics. So when we're talking about evolution, we have to remember that there's two major components of evolution. The first is the theory of evolution, the explanation of how evolution works, and evolution itself is observed. So let's talk about Darwin's theory of evolution now. The first component that's important for Darwin to explain this, and by the way, he came up with the explanation of how evolution works, an explanation of how evolution works. But the one thing he couldn't explain is how things are inherited. How did creatures inherit these traits? He knew, based on observation, that traits were inherited. He knew a lot about how evolution worked, but he could not explain how things were inherited, how these traits were inherited, and how they were transmitted. That came later with Mendel's work, was rediscovered and studied. So population genetics really does look at how this works, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in postings to come. So one of the major components of what Darwin was talking about is this idea that populations make too many babies. So in general, when you're looking at a population of any creature, they produce more offspring than can be expected, that could possibly be expected to survive. So when you look at a fish, it might lay 10,000 eggs, and you'll have 10,000 embryos developing. The fish no one expects all 10,000 to survive. The same thing goes with a dandelion. If you look at a field of dandelions, what you'll see is thousands, tens of thousands of individuals. You couldn't possibly expect all these dandelions to survive, but even if you did, when you think about each one of these flower heads then releasing hundreds, if not hundreds, let's just say hundreds of individual dandelion embryos to the wind to spread even more, it's obvious that not all of these are going to survive. There'll be animals eating them. There'll be competition between individual species and between individuals. One dandelion will outcompete another and kill it. There'll be all kinds of different factors that we're going to be looking at that are going to determine which of the dandelions here survive and which don't. But not all of them can possibly survive and keep multiplying continuously. I think that should be fairly clear that there has to be something that's going to limit them. Now, which ones survive and which ones don't. That's the idea of best fit to survive. And think again about fish. These are embryos from one female fish laying 10,000 eggs. You can't obviously expect 100 fish each to lay 10,000 eggs in a pond and expect that all of these individuals are going to survive. Some of these will be eaten, some will outcompete the others, some of these will die in various other ways. Which ones survive and which ones die? Evolution tries to predict that. The theory of evolution tries to predict what is it that happens when a population, when individuals reach this natural state that we find ourselves in, because organisms tend to overproduce, over-reproduce, to produce more offspring than can possibly survive for a given environment. And the other part of Darwin's theory of evolution is that there's variation, that among these individuals in the population, some, in the case of the snails, some are dark, some are light, and some are in between. So too here among the dandelions, there's some variation. Who knows? I mean, obviously they all look very much alike, but perhaps some of these grow faster, some grow slower. Perhaps the roots grow deeper, or others not as deep. Perhaps they make more offspring. The structure of the embryonic parachute is better for some of these than others, and because of those differences, some of these will be better fit to survive and others won't. Same with these embryos. Even though they all look alike, some might mature faster, some might be able to swim better, some might be able to see better, some might be able to eat quicker, larger teeth. All kinds of different things could be different among any two individuals, just like you and your brother or you and your sister. Even though you're related to each other, even two twins that you might look very much alike, might have some subtle differences in their environmental influence, because of environmental influences or because of individual mutations after they were first conceived. There could be a subtle difference that would give one an advantage over the other. So when you look at the concept of evolution, is that first you have overproduction, too many young to survive, so only some of them will survive. And the second is that there's variation, so that some will have an advantage over others. So natural selection occurs when you have this variation among way too many individuals to survive. So some die out, and those that die out don't send their genes to the next. Today we know their genes. Darwin couldn't explain this, but today, because of Mendel, the work that we studied earlier before the quarantine, we know that there's this idea that these genes were passed down from one generation to the next. Those that could not pass their genes on because they were selected out, they were eaten, killed, died because they couldn't compete against their brethren, they did not send their genes to the next generation. Those that could survive, in this case the dark-shelled ones, were able to survive very well. So only some of the light ones were able to pass on their genes. Perhaps some of these were heterozygote, so you get some light colored shelled creatures, but most of the population is dark shelled. So you start off with a variation, something happens, something selects. Perhaps it's a bird eating all the light colored shelled snails because they don't blend in, they're not as camouflaged as the darker shells. Perhaps it's some other predator that selects the lighter shelled creatures to be eaten. So the dark shelled creatures are the ones that are able to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so in the next generation, you see the dark shelled creatures predominantly in the population, where you used to have a great variation. So as the environment changes, which trait is best fit to survive changes. It's going to be a key point because in Darwin's theory of evolution, best fit to survive is not some ideal. It depends on the environment in which the population finds itself. And so it's always changing. So evolution is always occurring. So now go ahead in your own words, describe how Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection provides an explanation for the change in appearance of a species over time. I gave you my words, now you go ahead in your words and explain it here.